Good afternoon and welcome back to the Leadership Institute studios. I'm Kyle Bechet, Communications Manager here at the Leadership Institute. Our topic for today is the real nature of politics, and we're joined with the Leadership Institute's President and Founder, Morton Blackwell. Morton, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be with you, Kyle.
Yes, I think we're going to have a great discussion today about the real nature of politics and some history that's behind it. But before we get into today's topic, I would like to remind all of our viewers at home that this is a live broadcast, so you can have your questions asked and answered. Morton loves questions, so send those questions in to live@leadershipinstitute.org. You can also follow along and comment on today's broadcast by using the hashtag LIWebinar on social media. With that, we'll get right into today's topic, the real nature of politics. And I guess the best place to start, Morton, is what is the real nature of politics?
Kyle, what I'm about to share with you is probably the most important lesson you will learn at any time in your life about success in the public policy process. Conservatives did not understand the real nature of politics for many years and certainly did not begin to teach it systematically until the early 1970s. Many conservatives today haven't learned it yet. Please bear with me as I begin with the important historical background. I'll get to the key concepts soon enough. What was the greatest difference between conservatives who supported Barry Goldwater in 1964 and those who supported Ronald Reagan in 1980? Most people don't know the answer. The majority today aren't old enough to remember the 1964 presidential campaign, but Barry Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative, is still in print and available, and it's still widely read. Fortunately, most people still remember Ronald Reagan and his conservative principles. Anyone who supported Goldwater in 1964 and Reagan in 1980 can tell you that there was no significant difference in philosophy between Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. You can see this for yourself. If you read The Conscience of a Conservative, published in 1960, you will see that Barry Goldwater's positions on public policy issues then were very close to those of Ronald Reagan in 1980. I can tell you from my personal experiences in the 1964 Goldwater campaign and in the 1980 Reagan campaign that there was one great difference between the approach to politics of the Goldwater supporters and the Reagan supporters 16 years later. The difference was that we Goldwater supporters tended to believe that being right, in the sense of being correct, was sufficient to win. We firmly believed that if we could prove we were right, if we could logically demonstrate that our candidate was of higher character and that his policies would be better for our country, somehow victory would fall into our deserving hands like a ripe fruit off of a tree. That's not the real nature of politics. I call that misconception the Sir Galahad theory. I will win because my heart is pure. Do you know what was the most used slogan of the Goldwater campaign? It was this: in your heart, you know he's right. Unfortunately, the real world doesn't work that way, as we who supported Goldwater found out when Lyndon Johnson trounced us. Johnson got 41 million votes, and Goldwater got 27 million votes.
So Morton, what did you learn about all of that? What happened to those people that believed in the Sir Galahad theory?
To this day, I'm convinced Barry Goldwater would have been a better president for the United States than Lyndon Johnson. But Lyndon Johnson won big. Some Goldwater conservatives were so shocked and disappointed that they dropped out of politics and were never seen again. But not all of the Goldwater people left. Many of us stayed involved. Lots of us traveled similar paths and wound up working together again. In 1964, I had served as the youngest elected Goldwater delegate to the Republican National Convention. The next year, 1965, I came to Washington, D.C. to be executive director of the National College Republicans. Others with solid Goldwater pedigrees moved into the national scene at about that same time. A young Goldwater supporter named Richard Viguerie came to Washington in 1965 and created his direct mail firm. He soon became the dominant national consultant in political direct mail and is still a leader in that field today. Another notable young conservative, Ed Fulner, came to Washington in 1965 to work for a think tank. Then he became a leading conservative congressional staffer. Then he became president of the massive and effective Heritage Foundation. Another young Goldwater supporter, Paul Weyrich, came to Washington the next year in 1966 to serve as press secretary for a conservative U.S. senator from Colorado. Weyrich soon became the key conservative expert on politics on Capitol Hill. He later became America's most successful organizer of conservative organizations and institutions, playing a key role for more than 40 years in founding important new groups. Now, all of us had supported Goldwater, but none of us was prominent in his campaign. In fact, none of us even knew each other until we got to the D.C. area and began to build our own national reputations as fighters in different ways for conservative principles. But in those days, our past support of the Goldwater campaign was a priceless credential among fellow conservatives. Lee Edwards, a friend of mine who served as Director of Information in the 1964 Goldwater campaign, had founded in 1965 what was probably the D.C. area's only conservative public relations firm. Now, Dr. Edwards, he has become the nation's foremost historian and biographer of the conservative movement. In May 1972, Edwards introduced me to Richard Viguerie. A week later, Viguerie hired me away from the conservative think tank where I then worked in D.C., and he said, "Morton, I want you to come help me build a conservative movement." Richard Viguerie meant what he said, and his words were music to my ears, because building a conservative movement was exactly what I wanted to do. Soon, with my help as his political assistant, Richard Viguerie began to gather frequently a small group of experienced, totally reliable conservatives who were serious about trying to figure out how to win for conservative principles. Included in those our meetings were those I have named, including Lee Edwards and others whom we knew shared our conservative principles and our determination eventually to win for those principles in government, politics, and the news media. We were tired of losing.
So you're tired of losing, but what did you learn? How are you going to stop losing and start winning?
Well, at our gatherings, we discussed what had worked well for the political left, why conservatives had lost so many political battles, and what conservatives might do to win in the future. It came down to this: what is the real nature of politics? And here was our first great conclusion. Being right, in the sense of being correct, is not sufficient to win. You don't win just because your heart is pure, even if you can prove logically that you are right. Well, what then does determine victory? In our frequent meetings and discussions, we came up with our second great conclusion. The winner in a political contest over time is determined by the number and the effectiveness of the activists and leaders on the respective sides. That fundamental understanding changed our thinking. It explains why the side that's right doesn't necessarily win. Next, we considered the vital question of what determines the number and effectiveness of the activists and leaders on a given side. Clearly, numbers and effectiveness do not depend on which side is right. Our third great conclusion was the number and effectiveness of the activists and leaders on a given side in a political contest is determined by the political technology used by that side. That explains a lot of political history, including why bad causes like communism attracted a lot of activists. The people on the left used effective political technology. In contrast, most conservatives had relied on proving we are right. Political technology can be roughly divided into communications technology and organization technology, with no neat line of separation between communication and organization. Most political technology is philosophically neutral. Techniques which work for the left can work for conservatives. Techniques which work for Republicans can work for Democrats, and vice versa. Similar techniques can work whether a public policy battle is an election, or a legislative battle over tax rates, or the right to keep and bear arms, abortion, or any other issue. In the 1970s, when we made what were for us these discoveries about the real nature of politics, we saw this new understanding as a terrific insight which could lead to victory for conservative principles in the public policy process of government, politics, and the news media. But because most political technology is philosophically neutral, most people who are deeply committed philosophically tend to disdain or to study or use political technology. Instinctively, people devoted to their political principles tend to think learning mere skills is beneath their dignity because techniques are philosophically neutral. Such people are, after all, thinking about and proving their wonderful, deeply held views on important public policy questions. Is abortion the murder of tiny babies? What must be done to stop the spread of world communism? What must be done to keep big government from destroying economic liberty and prosperity? They will take my gun only by prying it from my cold, dead fingers. God made man, but Winchester made men equal. Serious questions. Serious people can get very excited about issues and philosophic differences, but they instinctively tend to think poorly of the study or the practice of philosophically neutral skills. Political technology is composed of a universe of specific techniques.
So what are these techniques, Warren?
Of course, not all political techniques are philosophically neutral. Terror is an evil technique used most commonly by the left. Communists famously and effectively use terror to grab and keep power, and so do radical Islamic extremists. But most political technology has no inherent philosophical content. For an example, how do you design a piece of literature? How do you raise funds? How do you organize a precinct? How do you attract a crowd to a political event? How do you communicate to a mass audience online? Those techniques can work for anybody. You may wonder now what I mean by techniques. Most of the useful techniques don't involve complex computer programming. Let me use, for example, techniques available for something as simple as a name tag. How often have you seen pre-printed name tags which begin in big letters with, "Hello, my name is"? Here's a sample. That's a bad name tag technique. The printed message is useless, and it takes space on the name tag, which could be used for communications. How many times have you attended meetings where someone has thoughtfully prepared name tags for everyone in advance, in letters about the size a typewriter would produce? That's a bad technique because it wastes space which could be used for communications, and it can't be read. Here's an example. Name tag, typed on a typewriter. How many times have you had to write your name on a name tag with a thin line ballpoint pen or even a pencil? Here's an example of a name tag written by a fine ballpoint pen. A name tag written by a wide line felt tip pen is easier to read. Here's an example, easy to read. Often people print or write names on name tags in all capital letters. That's a bad technique because capitalizing only the first letters of each word make the name tag easier to read. The name on a name tag should comfortably fill the entire space available. And where do you place a name tag? Most people fill out the name tag or get a name tag and then place the name tag on their left shoulders, like this. Right hand, left shoulder. Wrong. The best place for your name tag is on your right shoulder, where people can most easily read it when you extend your right hand to greet them, like this. He can see the name tag. If the name tag were here and we were shaking hands, he wouldn't be able to read the name tag. Very few techniques in politics are as complex as rocket science. Most are as simple as learning the types of print font which are easiest to read, or what I've said about name tags. The right techniques can make you more effective in everything you work to achieve. Each good technique you use in politics makes it more likely that you will win. But many philosophically committed conservatives tend to believe that being right, in the sense of being correct, is sufficient to win.
So how did you convince these kind of people that they had to learn how to win? I mean, you know, it must not have been easy.
Those of us who began to meet in 1972 discovered the real nature of politics. The winner in a political contest over time is determined by the number and the effectiveness of the activists and leaders on the respective sides. And the number and effectiveness of the activists and leaders on a given side is determined by the political technology that side employs. We knew that many of our conservative allies thought otherwise, and that we would have to persuade them differently. Here is how we convinced many of them. We shared with them our analysis of the real nature of politics, which I've just repeated, and then we said, if that is true, you owe it to your philosophy to study how to win. You owe it to your philosophy to study how to win. You have a moral obligation to learn how to win. If you allow your opposition to learn better how to organize and communicate than you do, and they implement that technology, they will beat you no matter how right you are, and you don't deserve to win. That is a persuasive argument. When you talk in terms of a moral obligation, you're talking in terms people can understand if they have a strong philosophical commitment. We began to have success teaching committed conservatives this, the real nature of politics, and it had a remarkable and sudden impact. New groups began to spring up in a wide range of issue areas. A wide variety of specialized organizations, educational foundations, legal defense foundations, lobbying organizations, and political action committees. Conservatives began to study how to win. Existing conservative organizations also began to grow very rapidly. For example, in 1972, one of the biggest, most effective, most famous, most respected, and even most feared organizations on the conservative side was the National Right to Work Committee. In 1972, this famous group had 25,000 members, and they were thought of as really big stuff. Then they began to study and use communication and organization technology. They began to grow throughout the 1970s, from 25,000 members in 1972 to 1.7 million National Right to Work Committee members in 1979. Then they really were big and could affect policy in a major way. At first, a handful of new conservative groups started, then dozens. Then conservatives started hundreds of new national and local groups. Each new or newly large group contributed an increase in the number and the effectiveness of conservative activists and leaders.
So you have momentum going. The conservative movement is taking shape. What was the effect of this new success that you were seeing?
Well, by 1980, conservatives had the political muscle across the country not only to nominate Ronald Reagan for president, but to elect him. That wasn't the first time Reagan had run for president. I was a Reagan alternate delegate in the presidential campaign of 1968 when he made his first brief run for president. Again, I was a Reagan alternate delegate in 1976 when he ran against President Ford for the nomination and almost won. By 1980, the conservative movement had grown remarkably. Reagan won nomination convincingly and then won election. And I got to serve 3 years on Ronald Reagan's White House staff. All of this is of central importance for you because the potential for the growth of conservative political strength still exists. The rapid, spontaneous growth of grassroots conservative activity through the Tea Party movement in 2009 and 2010 proves that. It turns out that the more groups you have and the greater the number of people you activate and teach how to be effective, the more power that you have to impact on the public policy process. I don't have to tell you how often Supreme Court decisions on liberal versus conservative issues are decided on a narrow vote, often 5-4. The next Congress is likely to be closely divided between conservatives and the left, with many congressional elections decided by only a handful of votes. The margins of victory in the American public policy process may be smaller now than at any other time in American history. You can make a difference now and in the future.
So where does somebody learn how to make a difference?
A number of American conservative activists the number is certainly growing now. And to grow in effectiveness, they must study how to win. My Leadership Institute now offers 47 types of training schools in the public policy process. You can review those 47 types of schools at leadershipinstitute.org. Political training is now available for conservatives online, on demand, and free, 24 hours a day. Other conservative organizations also offer worthwhile training you should consider. Nothing would be more disappointing politically than for conservatives to lose because of avoidable mistakes. So I urge you, remember the real nature of politics and the clinching argument which has revived the power of conservative principles in America. You owe it to your philosophy to study how to win. You have a moral obligation to learn how to win.
Excellent, Morton. Thank you very much for that. We had a lot of questions come in from our live at home audience, so we'll get to some of those. Just a reminder for everybody still watching, you can have your questions asked, and you do that by emailing us at live@leadershipinstitute.org, and then we'll get those questions up. But our first question comes from somebody I think you're familiar with. Patty Simpson asked the first question, as she usually does.
And they're almost always, in fact, I think always, good question. Let's see what Patty wants to know.
Okay, so Patty, when you were talking about Richard Viguerie, she said, and when he asked you to come build the movement with him, she wanted to know who was the most effective organizer on the left when Richard Viguerie started this effort?
Well, I confess my expertise on the left doesn't come close to what I know about conservatism. There were a lot of organized leftists. The left dominated the mass media. When I got started in politics, the left controlled all the broadcast networks, and there were no cable networks. They controlled the major news magazines. They controlled most of the major daily papers. And conservatives simply didn't have the capability of communicating with each other without going through the filter of the liberal media. I mean, there were a couple of people who appeared on the radio who were conservatives, Paul Harvey on the ABC network, Fulton Lewis Jr. There were some conservative periodicals, National Review magazine, Human Events, but they were tiny in circulation. And the left was already well organized. In the area of faculty on college campuses, people are well aware how left-wing the campus faculty is today, but I can tell you 40 years ago and 50 years ago, there was still a substantial domination of the left on the college faculty. And every leftist of whatever stripe understood this. I became friends in the late 1960s with a senior editor of National Review named Frank Meyer. He was a brilliant fellow, wrote columns in every issue of National Review, wrote books, spent an awful lot of time in political activism. He probably was the single person who spurred the formation of the Conservative Party of New York State, and he frequently came to conservative gatherings. We became friends. Frank Meyer in the 1930s and 40s was an active member of the Communist Party of the United States, as was his wife. He was an organizer for them and an intellectual for them. But in the early 1940s, he got hold of a book by F.A. Hayek entitled The Road to Serfdom. And he turned to his wife after having read the book, which talked about the merits of economic liberty. And he said to his wife, "The party will have to answer this." But the party didn't answer that. And he broke away from the communists and shortly became a conservative intellectual. It's rather commonly known that converts can be very enthusiastic and effective, and he certainly was. He died in the early 1970s, and it was a great loss. But he once told me that while he was active in the Communist Party, of course, knew who their members were who were on college faculties. And he told me that every time a Communist Party member who was a professor passed the word that some graduate student he had cultivated was looking for a teaching position in some college and university, having got a PhD or maybe a master's degree, he told me that the communists could place that young communist who just got the graduate degree on a college faculty somewhere in America within 48 hours. And it wasn't just the communists, it was socialists of every stripe and liberals who understood this, and there were efforts made that were skilled efforts. The communists and other Marxist and socialist organizations in those days studied how to win. If you go back and read their literature, not their public newspaper like the Daily Worker, which was a propaganda sheet, but you read things like the World Marxist Review, and you will find that the communists spent an immense amount of time discussing how to win, and discussing how, if communists get into a coalition government somewhere in some country in the world, how the communists can maneuver within that coalition to take over the government. And you want to get in charge of the Interior Ministry, which in most countries handles the internal secret police. You put that in the hands of a totalitarian, you got a big advantage, et cetera. So I can't think of any one single person who was responsible for organizing on the left, but it was ingrained in the left when I was your age, Carl. The left all understood that. Conservatives did not understand that.
Mm-hmm. It was more of a conservatives kind of made the logical argument rather than the argument to win.
Well, when we spread the understanding of the real nature of politics, I mentioned earlier that my close friend of decades, Paul Weyrich, who's sadly been deceased for some years, he became the most successful organizer of conservative groups in America, and groups like the Heritage Foundation and the House Republican Study Committee and the Senate Steering Committee and the American Legislative Exchange Council and many, many other groups. He was instrumental in getting them started. But he wasn't the only one who was out there organizing. There were huge numbers of people. As the 1980s and the 1970s developed, those of us in this small group that I talked about that were meeting trying to figure out how to win, concluded that there was what I called a huge tract of virgin timber on the political landscape that had never been employed, and that were theologically conservative Christians. And so we set about to figure out a way to find a theologically conservative religious leader who could organize huge numbers of conservatives in an effective way. And we settled upon, among many possibilities, there were a lot of conservative preachers who had national followings, and we decided that probably the one most likely to be interested in doing it and who would be effective was the pastor of the Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, Reverend Jerry Falwell. So we sent a delegation. Several of us went. I didn't make it on that trip, but Paul Weyrich went on that trip and laid it out to him, and in the importance of doing this and the potential of being more effective in the public policy process. And Paul said at one point, Dr. Falwell, I believe there's a moral majority out there waiting to be organized. And a little while later, Falwell interrupted and said, I like that. We can use it. Paul said, you like what? He said, moral majority. That's what I'm going to call my new organization. And by the 1980 elections, Jerry Falwell had organized tens of thousands of theologically conservative pastors across the country in a massive voter registration drive within the churches. And they registered at least 2 million people who were not at that time registered.
Wow.
And it could be higher than that. I've seen numbers as high as 5 million, but I would stake my life on it. There were at least 2 million newly activated people. So a lot of people caught the spirit of this and concluded that the best way for them to achieve things for conservative principles was to either study how to win and build a new organization, or if they already headed an organization, and Falwell already had a big, massive national televised ministry, figure out how to use techniques and skills to build something much, much larger and more effective. Mm-hmm. So it's now, to many, to a significant extent, the genie is out of the bottle. I mean, there are now thousands of conservatives, tens of thousands of conservatives who could quote what I said repeatedly about the real nature of politics, and who have internalized that they have a moral obligation to study how to win. So there's no one single person among conservatives who is behind all the activity. It is multiplied and it's growing, and obviously I want to do all I can to encourage this growth, but there are lots of people who now understand that. That's why after we had success with the Leadership Institute, mm-hmm. a number of other organizations have begun to do political training programs, and I'm delighted that they are doing this.
Mm-hmm. It's all about building the movement, and that 2 million that you mentioned before, that's the difference between an election, so that's a very important thing to take away from this. Couple of questions from some other of our at-home guests. The next one comes from Diane, who is watching from Canada today, but she asked a specific question about she has made an observation that there are a lot of pro-life groups in her country, in Canada, and she's wondering, is it better to have many or just one central organization? And you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but address the question directly.
I think that the effectiveness of a viewpoint is increased if there are a substantial number of effective organizations working on that project. And I would encourage people not to think that just because there's some organization currently working in an area that's very important to you, that's no reason for you not to create another organization. It may be the most productive thing for you to get into that the existing organization and build it up, but you may think of ways to build an organization and increase the number and effectiveness of conservative activists that other organization isn't employing. And these public policy organizations that are conservative are funded 99.9% by voluntary contributions. The left gets a great deal of their money, even the majority of their money, somehow tapping into taxpayer money and getting government subsidization of what they're doing. But conservatives have to depend on voluntary contributions, and having a number of organizations increases the resources that are available, because some donors will like the head of one organization and they might not like the head of another organization. And there are some people who will give to one organization and will also give a like amount of money to another organization. So you've got more people making contributions and individual people making larger total contributions, which have the effect of increasing the number and effectiveness of the activists in that area. So there's a significant disadvantage if you have just one group. When Jerry Falwell built up the Moral Majority, there were several other national conservative religious organizations led by charismatic and effective people who did other things, created other organizations. Reverend Pat Robertson, also located here in Virginia, created the Christian Coalition. And down in Florida, Dr. D. James Kennedy, a Presbyterian who had a national ministry, he began to activate people in the public policy process. And it worked marvelously. And if you have just one organization, then your opposition can focus all of their attacks and criticism and legal savagery and media abuse on that one person. But if you have a number of different organizations, then it's very hard to demonize them. When we had the Tea Party upsurge in 2009 and 2010, the Tea Party was very spontaneous, a grassroots operation. There were shortly several different national Tea Party organizations. They didn't always get along with each other. Some of them actually really disliked each other. But they were all involved, each one involving more people. And the more skilled they were, the more people they could organize. And there were state Tea Party groups and local Tea Party groups and two Tea Party groups vying for who could do the best for conservative principles in a single city. It was great. And I think the movement is stronger if there are a number of independent, competent people running their own operations with skill and honorably with a goodwill.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seemed to me, I was a novice, a political novice still in college at the time in 2009, probably just involved in my college Republican group, and just watching the Tea Party growth it seemed like it was a lot better to have small, many groups out there, just so, like you said, the media wouldn't focus on just one and try and tear that one person down.
And there are people who do dumb or bad things. And if the head of the one centralized group gets discredited, it has awful effect. But if you have 6 or 7 effective groups out there, and one of them has some catastrophe happen in it, the others are not necessarily, and probably aren't, tainted by that, and they can go on and do great things.
Right, absolutely. Our next question from our live audience comes from James, and he first mentions that he loves the Adam Smith tie. So we got some keen eyes out there.
Well, we make a commercial here. The Leadership Institute is the sole producer and distributor of Adam Smith merchandise. We have 8 Adam Smith ties, and we have 2 very nice ladies' silk scarves. We have cufflinks and tie bars for Adam Smith. And the Adam Smith tie was the club tie of the Reaganites in the Reagan administration. Ed Meese wore an Adam Smith tie, I think, every day working in the Reagan White House, and so did I. And it became clear that the really committed Reaganites were wearing this, and the people who were selling them at the time found that sometimes people who weren't good conservatives would buy the tie and wear it for protective coloration.
Oh, that's an interesting story. I don't think I've ever heard that one before. Anyways, his question is on, he lives in an entrenched liberal state, and he wants to know, how does one get the conservative message heard in these entrenched liberal states? I mean, is it it's possible, but I mean, it seems like you'd have to be very committed to these tactics to even move the needle.
Well, if you are in a liberal environment, and there are lots of states that are left-wing strongholds, and in those states, virtually every newspaper is owned and run and written by the left, and the TV stations are on the left, you could get the idea that you are alone and you're the only conservative anywhere for miles around. That's not true. Even in the most dedicated liberal strongholds, big cities, counties that are dominated by the left, there are lots of people who share your views. One of the big differences, I alluded to it earlier, that between when I got started and now, was that there are means of communication. So you can identify and become acquainted with like-minded people without having to go through the filter of the leftist monopoly which used to exist in the media. The Tea Party did not get itself organized by the publicity that it received on ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. The internet was the key to organizing the Tea Party groups. And so prior to that, one of the things that Richard Viguerie made possible as the father of conservative direct mail, really the father of political direct mail in the United States, he found that direct mail worked. You could send out letters directed to particular people, and what you communicated to them was what you wanted to communicate. They received what you wrote. That's a direct communication. Telephones were also available. You could do telephone boiler rooms and find people that way. So the people will be surprised. It's sort of like what happens to us on college campuses. I worked membership tables, recruitment tables on campuses for years and years in Louisiana and in many other states when I was executive director of the National College Republicans. I actually kept a tally of it, and I worked recruitment tables on 312 different campuses over a long period of years. And one of the most common things that was told to me by people as I stood in front of a table talking to passing students and would ask, are you a conservative or are you a Republican? There are always going to be some people on that campus who will agree with you. And so one of them will come by and they will say, yes, I'm a conservative, but I think I may be the only one on campus. And you continue to work the table, and 5 or 10 minutes later, somebody else comes by and says the same thing, thinking, I think I may be the only conservative on campus. I once spent 2 weeks in the late winter of 1968, organizing college Republican clubs in Florida. And in 10 working days, I organized 11 new college Republican clubs. The most interesting school in Florida turned out to be a small college, which was then a private school, called New College in Sarasota, Florida. And that was a stunner to me because that was the first time I ever was on a college campus where most of the students were barefoot. And the rest of their attire went well with the fact that they were barefoot. I found a lot of conservative students, and I was trying to get people to start a college Republican club, and I got a number of people to sign up. We had an organizational meeting that night, got a college Republican club started there, and people were astonished to find that there were lots of other students whom they had never known because the left-wing ambiance on the campus. But one of the great ones was there was this kid who came up, and I asked if he was a Republican, and he said yes, and we talked a bit about it, and I said, we're having an organization meeting, and here's where we're going to be having the meeting tonight at 8 o'clock. And he wrote it down, and he said, I'll certainly be there. Then he walked, I don't know, 10, 15 yards, and then I saw him turn around, and he walked back to me, and I had asked him, remember, are you a Republican? He said, yes. He walked back to me and he said in a quiet voice, and I'm a conservative, he said. So they're out there. You got to find those people and work with them. A locality can be overwhelmingly left-wing, but it may be possible under certain circumstances to win elections statewide. And if you live in a hardcore left-wing area, a vote that of somebody that you identify and you get to register and vote in that city in that election counts as much as in a statewide election as somebody who lives in an overwhelmingly conservative area. So you've got to do the best you can with what you have where you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I know this challenge very well growing up in Vermont, that there was not a lot of Republicans, but if you searched, you might find a few that might even be conservative.
Absolutely. I gave 3 youth coordinators to the re-election campaign of elderly Vermont Republican Senator Winston Prouty in 1970. 3 youth coordinators I gave. And Prouty was being challenged in a Senate election by a Democrat former governor. It was a knockdown, drag-out event, and everybody thought that old Senator Prouty was going to lose. But we organized a really strong youth effort for him. I put 3 full-time people in that 1 congressional district state. They did a great job organizing, and they created a youth image around Senator Prouty. You laugh about it. I show you some literature from that campaign.
I'd be very interested to see it. We have time for one final question today, and it comes from another viewer at home, Sean, who wants to know about at what point does effectiveness trump the moral ethics that one might have? Should it ever trump your moral ethics?
No, you have to be guided by your morals. You can use philosophically neutral techniques. There's nothing immoral about using a philosophically neutral technique. But you've got to have high standards. In the political process, there are a lot of people who are motivated by things other than their political philosophy. People join because it's something to do. People join and participate in politics because they're looking to, at some point, maybe get rich in politics, and some people do. they are active because they're on a personal quest for power. Other people are involved in politics because it's a convenient way to meet people of the opposite sex, or in these days, perhaps of the same sex. But that's in the political process. You need to identify people who share your commitment to your conservative principles, and then work with them. You're not always going to be in a majority. I think one of the great problems that we have is that participating in politics necessitates you're working with people who aren't motivated necessarily by the same things that you are. And political parties have official committees that you get to serve on if you work to, in some cases, very easy to get on a local county committee of your party. But in the meetings, philosophically committed people are often uneasy about having to associate with folks who are participating for some other reason, and you have to sometimes steel yourself. And some meetings are long, and you've got to be there if you're going to be able to exercise strong influence in the direction of the politics of the city, county, state, nation, which means you have to be able to sit there when some foolish people are speaking nonsense, and a lot of people can't stand it, and they get up and I just can't do this. But it's important that you do it. You have to do it, because if good people aren't participating in politics, then politics will be run entirely by bad people, and we will lose our liberty, we will lose our prosperity, we will lose our culture.
I think that about is a perfect place to end on today, and sums up everything that we've been talking about today. And at the end of the day, I think everybody needs to learn the real nature of politics, and that's what I take away from all of this today. So Morton, thank you for joining us today.
Great, thanks,
and thanks for answering all of the questions that came in today. I'm sure that everyone will take this lesson forward and hopefully start doing good things to actually win the debates.
You can make a difference if you study how to win. Exactly.
And maybe everybody who watched today's broadcast will come to a Leadership Institute training to do just that. Thank you all at home for joining us today. This broadcast was recorded, as always, and will be online for you to view later. You can view that at leadershipinstitute.org/activism-on-demand. You can watch this yourself and share it with your friends who may not have been able to attend today's broadcast. And finally, I'd like to let you know that our next webinar will be on Wednesday, September 28th, and that will again be at our normal time at 3 p.m. So with that, have a good night and good luck.
Political technology determines political success. That's why Morton Blackwell created the Leadership Institute to train and equip conservative activists with the best tools available. Located in Arlington, Virginia, across the street from the Clarendon Metro Station, LI is metro accessible from both Reagan National Airport and Dulles International Airport. Public and overnight parking garages are also located nearby. If you requested housing during your training, check in with the security guard in the lobby after 5 p.m. Not all trainings offer housing. Guests staying at LI in the Dudley and Phyllis Whitman dormitories are to follow the instructions and the codes of conduct outlined in the dormitory contract. Students staying in the dorms have access to showers and basic amenities. At the start of the training, an LI representative will greet you and confirm your registration. Trainings are taught by a prominent network of volunteer faculty, all of whom are experts in their field. LI offers 44 different types of trainings, including classes in campaign management, communications, fundraising, and campus activism. Media classes are taught in the Sacker Multimedia Center on the 4th floor. In our studios, you will learn top-notch skills for public appearances. Join the Leadership Institute's growing network of conservative activists. Everything LI does is made possible through the generosity of our donors. Click this link